We are really glad that you could join us today. You are in very good company among people who are curious about the threads that tie us to our past, our families, our cultural landscapes within Cape Town. And today we will explore how we begin the meaningful journey of understanding where we come from, how we might trace our family histories, the cultural archives and resources that exist, and how all of this helps us connect not only to our ancestors or our stories, but to ourselves and our communities as well. And whether you already have some questions about your ancestry, or you're simply intrigued by heritage, or you want to use culture as a bridge to deeper connection for yourself, the session is designed specifically for you. We do encourage you to join in, participate, be active, ask questions, share your thoughts if you're comfortable, and take from this not just information, but inspiration as well. So before we begin, I'd love for you to please switch on your cameras so that it can be a little bit more engaging for our participants and for our presenters here. And then also please note that the session is being recorded as well. These are for people who couldn't attend the session this evening. But other than that, the session is existing because myself personally, I keep on being told or asked every Heritage Day that I don't know my history and that I don't know my culture. And as a collective team, we thought, let's do something about this, that the information that we have to share with you through our presenters as well, it's quite valuable information, and please do enjoy. So yeah, over to you, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Awe Masakanas. I am so glad that you are all here. We are taking on a journey that is something that is often underrepresented within our communities and challenged by others. And these others are not our enemies or people that we are not, engaging with. These others might be people that are misunderstanding what this Cape Flats community is made up of. What is this people like? Who are they? Where do they come from? And what we are aiming to do is to educate our communities about who we are, what we stand for as individuals and as a collective, and how that is represented within the larger scheme of things in our communities. And the aim of these sessions, Koppel as a whole, mental health and wellness sessions, is to guide our community through a structured view in response to all of the questions that the Cape Flats Art Festival has had to endure this year. And I use the word endure lightly. And ons was baie gesit. Like we were taken through the things. Earlier on in this journey, in January of this year, I was asked, who gives you the right to define colored identity? And I was like, what? How do I answer that? Because who does give me the right? And the person that asked that question was probably not ill-intended, but it had a little shake on me. And so this year was focused on answering that question to that person so that it can be something that carries value, carries weight, but also resonates with who I am as an individual. And that has brought about the mental health and wellness sessions for this year, which is focused on finding our roots as a base. Where do we start? Who are you? Understanding what the difference is between identity and race. What does community medicine and collective healing mean to us? Where does it come from? What is its origins? And then we also have a coaching for success, or how do we move from where we are right now into where we want to be as individuals. We also have an Indigenous medicine in-person session if anybody's in Cape Town. There are some tickets available still for that day. So before we continue with the depth of what we are going to explore, please note that we as an organization stand for very particular things. Please visit our website and we'll add it to the chat. But these views and these expressions and these things that are coming out today is coming from our people, it's coming from our communities. And we need to bring that to a space, to a platform, and let this be the platform for that. We would love everybody to please be, and now over to our presenter, who is Daiyaan Petersen, Dayaan's journey with us started by literally by chance through the work that he's already doing. We found a video of his and we immediately knew that we have found people that are aligned. Dayan is a archival researcher in his independent capacity, but also a student at UCT who is avidly working to finish up this year. And so he has taken the time to come and share with us. Please follow him on Instagram. He's available on that spaces, and he also has multiple other pages that would be of great use for you through this journey. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dayan.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Is it evening already? I think so. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Koppel workshop. I usually title this workshop as Tracing Without a Trace, because for many of us, whether you want to identify as colored, mixed, descendants of non-white communities that find ourselves in Cape Town, in the Western Cape, in South Africa, when we attempt to research our heritage, discover our heritage, we are met with all of these different brick walls very early on. And so for that reason, it appears that there is a trace of the specifics of our heritage within archives, within local histories, and so on, other than just broad, generalized statements or descriptions around some of our collective ancestors. And so through this workshop, I hope to equip all of you with various skills and forms of knowledge and understandings of local archives. There's one specific archive that I will be speaking directly, so that we can actually make use of these archives to trace without a trace, right? To read the archive from a decolonial perspective, and sometimes an anti-colonial perspective, and use forms. I'm using these big words now. It's the only time I'm going to use it. Forms of heteroglossia, multiple tongues, that even within the archive, there are multiple tongues that tell the story. And so, although from one perspective, it may seem that it's just the colonial story being told, right? If we apply some of these techniques and if we use different frameworks, we'll find that there are multiple narrators of our shared history. And it's up to us to act in the work to try and find out who is the narrator of our history, what is our heritage, and how can we sift through, some of these documents and archives that enables for our heritage and our history to come to the fore. So the contents of this workshop, I'm just going to go through the etiquette of working within the Cape Town or the Western Cape archives. And the purpose of this workshop is really for yourselves to go to the archives and make use of it and try and do your own research. And so I'll just guide you a little bit through what is the etiquette of when we do go there. Then I'll explain a little bit about archives, particularly again in a localized context. What are formal archives? What are informal archives? And how can they be used differently? And how significant are they in different ways? And then I'll be going through the methods, right? So the research process of how do we actually find the things that we are looking for. And then at the end, I'll show you, how I came to find a specific document. So I've got some scans of archival documents in here as well. Okay, so just the etiquette when we go to the archives. When I say the archives, I refer specifically and mostly to the Western Cape Archives and Record Services at number 72 Roland Street, so just opposite Harold Cressy. That is the oldest archive in the country. The oldest record there dates to 1651, which is the year that Van Riebeeck got onto the ship, never mind landing at the Cape, right? And so they've got a copy of his diary that he started making when he was on the ship, right? So 1651 it starts, and that archive continues to, I think, the last 30 years. So each following year, 30 years before that, when Home Affairs sends off their new batch every year to the archive. So we can see how vast it is. There's hundreds of kilometers of shelving in this place. And so you can well imagine, how old many of these documents are. And so for that reason, right, there is a lot of etiquette around making use of this archive, because this is sometimes the only document that makes mention of some of our ancestors, some of our histories, and so on. And so it's high risk, dealing with a lot of these documents, and also because of concentration when dealing with these documents. So just some of the reading room rules and regulations. That's the room where you go into the archives and you actually sit with the documents. To always maintain silence. No cell phones are allowed in the reading room. There are lockers. You also aren't allowed to take any photographs of the documents. You need special research permission if you want to take photographs of the documents in the archives. You can bring a laptop. You can bring a notepad and a pencil to transcribe some of the documents that you make use of. There's also a few research assistants that's there. Primarily, there's Erica. Erica is probably your most helpful research assistant when you get there. She's a good friend of mine. And if you have any questions, anything, Erica is more than happy to help you when you walk into the reading room. You may only order one document at a time. And for some people, it seems like a little, but when you're confronted by a massive, thick compendium of birth registers, you only really need one document, right? And so you can only order one document, and only one document is allowed on your table. And then you have to sit facing the counter, so facing Erica, to make sure that you aren't scribbling in these archival books, you aren't tearing out pages, and hiding it in your notes to take home, or perhaps you see something that you don't like about history, or somebody from a different community doesn't like how a specific community is portrayed, and they tear out the pages, and they chuck it. These are real things that have happened in the archives. Some other people have literally taken slave or enslaved people's resale certificates and gone to auction it off, right? Because of the value that these documents have. And so there's a lot of necessary policing inside the reading room because of some of these issues. And then finally, you don't just have to transcribe it. There are opportunities to actually make copies of these documents. There's a massive photograph collection. You can make copies of the photographs, amazing, beautiful photographs dating back to, the mid to late 1800s of many different things. You can make photographs, or you can make copies of a lot of these archival documents. One of my own favorites was my great grandfather. We actually signed with his own hand on a legal document, and it was quite special to me to have a physical photocopy of this man's signature, something that I had never seen in my life before. So these are just some of the rules around the reading room. One question that always comes up is, why isn't there a rule to use gloves? And this is because the oils on our fingers, people assume that the oils on our fingers might damage the paper. In actual fact, using gloves makes your fingers less sensitive to the paper. And so you are a lot more rough when dealing with the pages than using your own fingertips. And so it's actually best practice to just use your own fingers when dealing or when handling these archival pages. So that's just the etiquette of the reading room before we actually start or embark on our archival research. Okay, next we've got the concept of the archive itself, right? So around the world, you have archives of various different types. You've got family collections, you've got government archives, you've got, religious institutional archives. And most of these archives have been cataloged, transcribed. A lot of them have been digitized, and most of these form part of what are known as formal archives, right? So it has been consciously archived, right? And when we speak about the Roland Street archives or the Cape Town, Western Cape archives, that is a form of formal archiving, right? A lot of your church records, whether it's Moravian Church, Dutch Reformed Church, Wesleyan Church, whatever, a lot of those Bibles and baptismal registers and so on also form part of your formal archives. But something that is often neglected are things like informal archives, right? These are things that families have collected over time, perchance, or perhaps, with the intention of preserving it, for their children or grandchildren. And it had become an archive over time, right? There might not be a formal cataloging of this. It's just, it does exist. And there are these different documents, items, and so on, that exist in a semi-formal, often informal, haphazard collection, right? But that can be used as an archive in our research. And so I'll explain shortly now, actually, the significance of using these informal archives for our research before we actually get to the formal archives. Let me just go to the informal first. Yeah. So I like to divide the informal archives into three different forms, right? So for me, one of the most important, especially when dealing with Cape Town's history, my own research, are things like family heirlooms, right? So these include Bibles, talismans, diaries, journals, and then when we are dealing with the Cape Muslim or Malay community, the idea of kitabs, right? Kitab literally means book, but it's a specific book that had been written in Arabic or Arabic Afrikaans or Malay Arabic between the last 300 years and last 100 years, over that 200-year period, right? So in some of our family heirlooms like Bibles, a lot of families, our great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers would be recording the dates of birth of their children, the dates of death of their parents, when their siblings were born, a lot of genealogical information that are very useful in piecing together our own genealogy, and that can be used to take to another archive, and cross-reference to try and trace further. Then we've got diaries and journals. Apart from the Bibles, these work in a similar manner, except that it's a lot more detailed, where people were physically detailing a lot of their daily experiences, things that happen in their community. One key diary in Cape Muslim history is the diary of Imam Saban of Simonstown. A book and a thesis had both been published about it. And this Imam had been recording the history, the social history of mostly Muslims, but general people in Simonstown between around I'd say the 1860s up until around the 1920s, 1930s, right? So for as long as he had been living in Simonstown, practicing as an imam and so on. And this man, this imam, he was recording the births, marriages, deaths, burials, sick people, immigrants arriving in Simonstown, Zanzibari ship laborers that had landed in Zanzibar for a short period and left again, and their relations with some of the local women, where some of them were buried in Simonstown, their own religious ceremonies, and so on. And so it was quite a significant find and a significant tool, for people to make use of. And then when it comes to talismans, again, this is specific to the Cape Muslim community. Some people might be familiar with this term of Jumat or Ajumat or Azimat, which are these protective talismans that had been written, for the past 200-300 years in different scripts and hung around the neck. But what had been forgotten in the community is that the way that a lot of these talismans were made were specific to the person, right? Based on their name, based on their date of birth, based on the phase of the moon, based on the constellation, all of these specifics, right, around that specific individual. And so when we use these talismans and when we use some of the talisman guides that have been found in these informal archival collections, we can actually use the science or the system of how they came to write these talismans to work back and actually determine when were these people born, what time of the year were they born, what was the climate like. In my own research, it had helped me in tracing some people. And then finally, what's helped me quite a bit in using the family heirlooms is that I find that people often write their own name as having been an owner of this document. They write often their father's name as well, and then their grandfather as well. And so it's been quite useful to use these heirlooms in tracing our histories. Another informal source are your cemeteries. So a lot of people, we only think of the burial ground as where our forefathers are buried, but we don't realize that the tombstones itself serve as a archival source, right? That the names on the tombstones, the dates on the tombstones are useful to us as genealogists and as researchers in trying to trace our ancestors um, further. And so you've got many different tombstones or many different cemeteries around Cape Town, around the Western Cape in South Africa that can be used. And then I mentioned here again Jawi Mesangs, right? So this is a Malay word. It literally means Javanese tombstones. And these are specific tombstones that had been written in the Malay language that we find in Buka, in parts of Kimberley, in Worcester, in Simonstown, all around us without perceiving that they exist. And when we translate these tombstones, we find that many of them actually date to the period of slavery. And through my own research, I managed to find, using these tombstones, tracing the name of an enslaved individual who previously was only known by a slave name, right? Jan van Bugis. But making use of the tombstone, we found his birth name, Muhammad. We found his father's name, Fadl. We found his title, Hasnullah. We even discovered the exact place in Indonesia that he came from, which was the Borneo Regency, right? And so without these tombstones, we wouldn't know this information because we only had access to the colonial archive, right? So here we see the usefulness of the cemeteries. And then finally, what is probably most accessible to all of us is oral history. And I actually recommend people that when you get started on doing genealogical history, you sit by yourself and you start to map out your ancestors that you're aware of. But then you go and speak to some of those people that you have mapped out, right? You speak to your parents, you speak to your grandparents if they are still alive, you speak to uncles, aunts, your grandmother's cousin, the auntie in Newfields that is somehow related to you, but you aren't sure. And you start to interview elders in your family to actually build on the oral history, and some of these oral traditions and the social memory of your family, things that people are still aware of now as a foundation and as a base for us to continue our research, right? Then, as part of the oral history, we also have family law, right? So apart from just your parents telling you, maybe my great-grandmother's name was Johanna Boomgaard, for example, right? There's also stories and family law that was passed down that, I know that this grandmother, her grandfather, he was a Hollander, right? He was a Witman that came from the Netherlands. They lived there in the Upper Wynberg area, and they had a big house there. And so some of these, the family law or, these clues about forgotten treasures and so on, a lot of it is mythology for family, for honor, for pride, for dignity. But in those stories, we find that there is quite a bit of truths that are hidden within the family law that can assist us in our research. And then my favorite one is bedtime stories. And this is one thing that people never mention, is often neglected, but we don't realize that the bedtime stories told to us by our parents, that were told to them by their parents, and then by their parents, are sometimes stories of our own ancestors and our own culture and our own shared heritage that had been passed down over time. And I'll just tell you, I don't remember the full story, but just an anecdote of when I was a child. I was around 4, 5 years old. My parents were working late. And my great-grandfather, who I lived with at the time, my mother's grandfather, he was born in Freiburg, and he came from also, mixed background, half immigrant Indian and half, local descendant of enslaved colored and Malay people. He was born in Freiburg, and he grew up most of his life in Cape Town, right? But a lot of his culture, I suppose, came from a bit up north there. And he would tell me the specific bedtime story that I can't remember now, but there was only one section that I remember of the story. And he would tell me about this boy that would be walking on this path, and he came across this big farm, and he saw the boer, the farmer, sitting on his porch there. and to sort of uh, um, uh, make fun of the farmer. You would shout at the farmer, "Trek jou vier osse," right? Move or pull your four oxen or cows. Until today, I don't know exactly what it means. It was just a way of this boy making fun of this farmer for these four oxen, whatever it was. But through my research, I discovered that my family, from that side of the family, originally came from Cape Town and were of enslaved and were taken up to Kimberley, Mafeking, Vryburg, and likely had been farm laborers. And so they had this relation with farm owners in that region over there. And so it gave me a bit of an understanding into the social relations of my family, that perhaps they did see the farm owner as the boss and they were the workers, the boy, right? And so as a way of getting back at the boss, perhaps my great-grandfather's grandfather would be shouting at the boer, "Trek jou vier osse," right? And so these bedtime stories told to us, are encoded with some truth about our heritage and history. So it's not always about the name of the person, where exactly they came from, but sometimes it's just about this understanding of what was their life like, right? How different was times then compared to now, and just a more general understanding about our history and our heritage than the specifics of tracing our specific ancestors. So now that we have understood what our informal sources are and how valuable they are to our research, I'm now going to move towards our formal sources, right? Making use of formal archives. And some of them I've touched on already. The main formal source that we use in tracing our Cape history, or at least southern part of South Africa, the old Cape colony history, for those of us that have indigenous heritage, slave heritage, immigrant heritage, before the 1960s, the main archive that we make use of is the Western Cape Archive and Records Service. And so I will go through some of the sources or types of documents within that archive that is useful to us. The other formal sources that are useful to us, or formal archives, are newspaper archives. So one of the biggest newspaper archives that we have is the National Library by the Gardens. It is closed at the moment, but they do have a digital collection on their website for the National Library. And what's nice about that digital collection is sometimes you can type in keywords and it'll pop up those newspaper articles that mention those keywords, although it is a bit finicky, the website. Then we have something called the Almanac. Right? The Almanac, or the African Court Calendar, was the yellow pages of the colonial period, basically. It was a register. I can't get to the other term now, but it was basically a list of many people that were living in Cape Town during the colonial period. And so whether you were of settler origin, whether you were of slave origin, freed slave, and in the 1870s, a colored or mixed person, or Malay as they termed some of them that time, a lot of these people would be listed by their name, by the occupation, and by address as well. And so this is very useful and significant to us, in doing our heritage and genealogical research. And then lastly, we've got church records. And most of these church records include baptismal registers and marriage records. And these, for me, I actually find are one of the most useful documents, because some of the birth records in the Western Cape archives only start at a specific point, whereas many of these church records actually go back to the 1600s. And so we can use this to actually trace through baptismal entries, the parentage of many people. When it comes to Muslim history and mosque records, unfortunately, we don't really have that in our community. A lot of the churches were, those documents were compulsory for them to have. They had these church registers, whereas because Islam was a clandestine religion to begin with, and also it was a religion of the underclass, right, of enslaved and exiled people, there wasn't always access to paper, to pens, and people were still learning how to be literate around that time. And so most of the Muslim history is through oral tradition, as opposed to the mosque records, right? And then within our formal sources, I'll go through them by name, and then I'll just go through each one specifically. I've got a few slides that deal with each source specifically within the Western Cape archives, that from probably most useful to least useful in my research. So the first over here we see MOOC, so that's your master's office, the same master's office where we send our wills and estates to today. And it's those types of documents that can be found in the master's office. Some of them go back to the 1600s. Some of them only start in around 1834, but I will explain. Then we've got 3/CT. That is your Cape Town municipality, right? And those are very useful to us, particularly when it comes to our registers, so birth, death registers in the Cape Town municipality. You have other municipalities like Stellenbosch, that would be maybe 1/STB, Simonstown, 1/SMT, and so on. And you can find these specifics of the sources at the archives. Then we've got HAWC, which is Home Affairs Western Cape. Same Home Affairs we've got now, just there's Home Affairs Western Cape, Home Affairs Northern Cape, and so on. Then we've got IRC, which is our immigration files. We've got CO, which is the Colonial Office, which is where we find a lot of correspondences between members of our communities here in Cape Town and the government. And these are often useful in our research because they sometimes provide specifics about their livelihoods, where they live, who their family is, and so on. Then we've got RDG, which is Raad der Gemeente, which we can think of as a early form of municipal document. So before 3/CT was used, you had RDG. Then we've got CSC, which is your Cape Supreme Court, court cases, right, which are very useful for the British period. Then we've got J. I don't know what J stands for. All I know is during the Dutch period, they started something called the opgaafrollen, which is sort of like a taxation roll. And these were an early Dutch form of census records. And so in RDG, you also find census records from the British period. Then we've got SO, which is your slave office. And this was only set up in the British period from 1816. So it's quite late because slavery ended by 1838. So it's really the last bit of slavery at the Cape. But it does include, you know, the registration of every single slave or enslaved person in the colony. So it is useful to us. But as we go through it, we will find mention of enslaved people in some of the other sources. And one of them being the CJ, which is the Court of Justice. So this is your Dutch period court, and so on. And so I will be now going through each specific source, you know, what specifically you can find there, how do we find them, how do we make use of them, what is fascinating about them. Let's go to slide 13. Okay, so our first source that we are now going to be touching on is Home Affairs, the Home Affairs source. So I put the Home Affairs Western Cape. Most of my family is situated in the Western Cape, live in Western Cape, and so I deal mostly with the Western Cape. But the Home Affairs was only set up in around 1895, right? So that is very late considering our history. Our colonial history started in around 1652, right? So towards the last bit of the British being here, they set up something called Home Affairs, right? And Home Affairs, the mandate of this was to register every birth, every death, and every legal marriage in the colony, right? And so we can understand that 1895 is a very late date to start registering births. And so although it is useful, right, how do we then trace birth registrations before that date? And the reality is that we don't have any resources like that. And so it's for that reason why we have to use all of those other sources to try and piece things together, because Home Affairs only starts in 1895. And so they've got here the birth registers, you've got marriage registers, you've got death registers, and then you've got some ward masters returns, which is very scattered, you know, very rare. pre-1895 registrations. So I'm not sure if you guys can see the slide. I don't think I can zoom in very well. Um, but in the center here, we've got a copy of the birth register, right? Um, and in this birth register, just to show you the format of how the register looks, right? So when a child is born from 1895 onwards, the parents could take the child, or an uncle could go and report the birth of the child, or a relative, somebody that lives in the house, um, to the police station or some other, civil offices, whether it's in Cape Town, in Kimberley, in Port Elizabeth, uh, Kaiwega, in Simonstown, and so on, and they can record the birth, right? And so here we see a copy of the birth register. And so in the first column, it would have the date of birth over there, and it would have the address of where the child was born. Then it would have the sex of the female, whether the child is male or female. Then it would have the name of the father of the child. So in this case, it was Aji Hanslow. And then it would have the father's occupation. So he was a cab proprietor. So he owned horse and carts in those days. Then it would have the race, and we can see, the obsession with race in that period. I think this is from 1900. I really can't see the date on here actually because it's so small, it's blurry. And in this case, he was listed as a Malay. And so if we look down, we see different types of races. Sorry, oh, what's happening? Yeah, we see different types of races mentioned: Malay, white, European. It's fascinating that why is there a difference between European and white, around the time. And some people would be listed as mixed or colored. It's important also to understand the historical context, because when dealing with these colonial documents, sometimes the race descriptions can be very derogatory. And so when dealing with specifically people from the Eastern Cape, from the Xhosa community that were living in Cape Town and registering children, the race description would be the K word on formal legal documents. And so it's important for us that when we deal with these documents to be mindful of these things, that we also can't allow our understandings today to hinder the research that we are doing. Because in my own cases, sometimes dealing with enslaved documents, you become so emotional with how these enslaved people were treated that it's difficult to actually continue doing the research. But, it's important to understand this was the context and to make space and allow space for that emotion to come out, but continue doing the research because it's necessary. And so this is an example of a birth register. And so from the birth register, they would then compile a birth certificate, which you can then also get at the archives under this source of Home Affairs, whether it's Western Cape, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, and so on. Then here, I just put an example of a death certificate. So there's births, marriages, and deaths. And this is a death certificate of a woman by the name of Rukia Raycliffe, and it gives the maiden surname as Brenner. It gives the sex of the person, so she was female. It gives the age when she died, she was 71 years old. Again, the race, she was Malay. It gives where she was born, so Cape Province. It states that she was a widow. It states the occupation. And so most women in those days, if they didn't practice home duties, many of them would either be washerwomen, seamstresses, dressmakers, cooks, confectioners, and so on. It also stated that she was a pensioner, and that it gives the date of her death, which is in 1952. It gives her residence where she lived in Lansdowne. It gives the place of her death, which is York Road, Lansdowne. It gives where she was buried, so Thornhill Malay Cemetery, which is Johnston Road in Rylands. It gives what she died of, which was cerebral thrombosis, arteriosclerosis. We had a doctor in one of our sessions and he explained what that was. I can't remember, I'm not a doctor. It gives the doctor's name, how long she was sick, and then it also gives the person that signs for the death. So unlike the birth registers, where we can go back and we can try and trace the parents' names, right? With the death certificates, sometimes we don't actually know, is this person related to us? And so it's this informant of death that it gives us a clue that, okay, this person that signs is my grandfather. And so he's signing for his mother. So sometimes it will put their son or brother or so on. And so that's how we can actually trace using these death certificates. Similarly, with the birth registers, you actually notice there's no place for the child's name, or there is, but it's very, very rarely written. And that's because the child is registered before a name is even given. And so if you are looking for your granny, um, whether her name was Gertrude or Maraldia or whatever, and you're trying to trace her birth, you'd have to go to the birth register, knowing when she was born, knowing her maiden surname. You do not necessarily have to know her parents' names, but knowing roughly whereabouts she was born to try and piece these things together, because her own name might not appear on the birth register. So we can see how tricky it is sometimes in working with these home affairs documents. Next we've got the master's office, and so in the master's office, the full term MOOC is Master's Office of the Orphan Chambers, and that's because there were so many orphans around in the Dutch period that they had to wind up estates to look after these orphans, and so they set up the master's office, right? The Weerskamer, as it was known in the Dutch period. And in the master's office, your most crucial documents, in fact, for me, the most important document in doing any type of genealogical research is your death notice, right? And it's on these death notices that it has the person's name, their parents' names, their children's names, how old they were when they died, where they were born, where they died, their occupation, whether they were married or not, whether they had property, whether they had a will, and also somebody that signed for the death as well. Then you've got your wills, and inside these wills, you'll find the person who would submit a will, and often they'll actually give the children's names or their heirs' names in these wills, which are useful to us in tracing. Then we've got L&D accounts. So these are liquidation and distribution accounts. So if the person had an estate and they died, then the liquid assets would then go to and be distributed to their heirs. And so in these L&D accounts, we can see exactly who their heirs are, because sometimes the heirs are not mentioned in the will and sometimes omitted in the death notices also. Right? So using every source that we can to try and piece things together. And then finally, we've got our MOIB, which is Master's Office Insolvency Branch. And this is when people went insolvent, right? Many of them took out double mortgages. Times were very tough. They couldn't pay it, and they went insolvent, right? And so it's in these insolvency accounts where, because they went insolvent, they didn't have an estate when they died. And so going back when they were still alive in these insolvency accounts, it sometimes will say that this item, this chair in their house belonged to their son, to stop them from confiscating the chair for sale to repay the accounts. And so in these insolvency accounts, we can actually pick out sometimes relatives, a brother, a child, a father, and so on. This is something that I found for a friend of mine. His family was from Paul, and it was in an insolvency account that he came across the name of his ancestor, Isaac Fortuin, where previously it was only mentioned once, in like 1920s, right? And so for the first time, he found a document from when this guy, Isaac Fortuin, was still alive in the 1860s. So it's very useful. Next, we've got our colonial office. So our colonial office, a nice analogy that one heritage practitioner, Muhammad likes to use, is the colonial office that was at the Cape is the same colonial office that placed Lawrence in Arabia, right? So it's the correspondence between the colony and the crown. And so in these colonial office records, we find things like memorials. So memorials are effectively letters that are written by citizens to the colonial administration in the colony. We've got petitions, similar, petitioning the colonial administration. And then we've got requests to leave and enter the colony. And so for many of us that have immigrant heritage dating back to the colonial period, the colonial office records are very useful to us to determine when did they arrive, where did they come from, when did people go on pilgrimage to Mecca, things like that as well. So here I've got a Colonial Office document dating back to 1809, I believe. Um, and it is a colonial document about an enslaved woman by the name of Johanna Casperina van der Kaap. And it's around this individual, Casper Skoegaard. And basically what it's saying is that Casper Skoegaard is freeing this enslaved woman, Johanna Casperina, for the sum of 200 Rijksdaalders, right? So 200 Rijksdollars, Dutch currency. But why this was significant to us is that it showed us that using naming patterns, right? So firstly, enslaved people were usually only given one name. So her name would have been Johanna van der Kaap, right? But now we see that she's given a second name, Casperina. And the second name, Casperina, matches with the name of the person freeing her, right? Casper Skoegaard. And so we can make use of these documents to tell narratives and to try and piece together stories that it's likely that Johanna Casperina was actually an illegitimate enslaved child of Casper Skoegaard. And so he elected, to actually free his daughter out of slavery with whatever money he had. Casper Skoegaard is also my own ancestor via another child and another enslaved woman. He was an immigrant from Germany, and he actually left quite a few things to his other enslaved children that he never ended up freeing, but he left them a gold pistol and some bedding and stuff. But yeah, so just very fascinating working through these Colonial Office documents. And like you see here, it helps us in understanding these things. Next, we've got the Rater Gemeente. So this is, we can think of it as a early municipal documents. In here, we've got civic census, so census of free people that were living in the colony at the time, whether you were a settler or freed slave and so on. We've got license applications. For example, I saw previously an enslaved woman, I think her name was Massie van der Kaap, and she actually kept a greengrocer in St. John Street, so Upper Plain Street in town, right? And she was an ancestor of some people that I assisted. In here, we've also got free black returns. So these free blacks are freed enslaved people, right? And so the returns are these census documents. So it is literally who are all of the free blacks living in the city in 1817, right? And this is very useful to us in understanding that the slave period is very difficult to work with when doing genealogical research, as I'll explain soon. But these free blacks are the free people amongst them, right? And so there's more likelihood of documents existing for them, like wills, like death letters, and so on. And so we can trace back to some of the earliest periods of when they were free using these returns. And then also in RDG, you've got your slave manumissions. And so here I've actually put up an image of the slave manumissions over here. And so we've got a few enslaved people, many of them women, and the records of them being freed and what date. So for example, we've got Manisa van Samboa that was freed in 1807, Malati van Batavia, Moses van Madagascar. And here we've got the same Massie that had the license application in 1816 that had a greengrocer. En hier is Massie van der Kaap heeft vertoond in Vrybrief aan 21 Julie 1808. She had received her free letters or emancipation certificate in 1808 through Petrus Hout, right? And so here we can actually see who had been her enslaver, who owned her before, right? And we can go to his documents to actually try and trace further back to see, did he own her and her mother? Did she have any siblings? And working through these slave manumission registers to try and work back through the slave period. Then we've got our Cape Supreme Court documents. Again, we might not think that this is useful to us when it comes to genealogical research. But in these court cases, a lot of them were civil disputes, right? Not just necessarily, massive legal disputes like murder, theft, and so on. And so we've got a document over here, which was an annex to a court case that happened in around the 1840s about an Imam Badruddin in Wynberg. He was the first known Imam of Wynberg, and he was accused of receiving stolen goods, right? And so they had a court case uh, to convict him of this. And although many people stated that he didn't receive the stolen goods, there was some that said that no, he did, and we sold it to him ourselves. But this annex over here, I just want to read it out to you so that we can see how useful some of these documents are for us in tracing our genealogy, right? Because for Badruddin, we have no, he went to jail, right? So we have no estate files for him, no death notice, no will, nothing. We've got nothing for him at all other than these few court cases and so on to determine who were his descendants. And so in this annex of the court case, it says the little boy Iftakhuddin mentioned in the examination is the grandson of the prisoner Badruddin. He was brought up for examination, but on account of his only being 8 years of age, the magistrate declined having him sworn. And so this little boy, Iftakhuddin, actually went up and he wanted to go and defend his grandfather, to say that I was with my Opa, when these things were happening. And so my Opa is innocent of this, but because of his young age, he couldn't defend his grandfather and be sworn in court. But what's significant is that we have no other mention of Badruddin's family apart from his wife, Alisa. And for the first time, we find one document hidden away in the court case that he had a little 8-year-old grandson by the name of Iftakhuddin. And so we use this information to find out who are Badruddin's descendants, where did they live, where did Iftakhuddin live, and so on. So we can see how useful these court case documents are for us. And it's not difficult to find these documents, by the way. When you go to the archives, there is, next to the reading room, there's an inventory room, right? And it's in this inventory room where you will find registers, thick documents for 1860s court cases, right? For death and birth register indexes for birth registers for 1895. And you can order that document and, you can go through those to try and find your ancestors if you know dates and so on. And I will explain shortly, exactly how to find some of these things and the easier way as well. But just to note that it seems daunting, but a lot of these documents are quite easy to access at least. I'm just going to run through it shortly. Next, we've got our opgaafrollen. As I mentioned, this is a taxation roll, but this was really a Dutch period census. And so whether you owned oxen, whether you owned land, whether you owned people, whether you owned yourself, right, you were liable for tax. And so you then appeared on the taxation rolls. And so the case of Hawk Bay, Tracy Kwai, heritage practitioner, and she reads heritage, walks over there through these opgaafrollen. She could actually trace her great grandfather, Frederick de Vries, on these opgaafrollen to determine that this man was in fact living in Hawk Bay, at least in the 1820s already, to figure out, when did they move from Wynberg to there, who were his children, how many children did he have living there, how many men, how many women, how many male, how many female children, were there enslaved people living with him, those sort of documents in these opgaafrollen. Then we've got the slave office documents, right? So as I mentioned, the slave office was only set up in around 1816, so very late, and that's why we have to use those other slave manumission documents and colonial office correspondences like we saw with Casperina, Johanna Casperina, and so on for pre-1816 to try and work through these networks and through these systems to figure out where were the enslaved people, what relations did they have to each other, how did their families form, right? But after 1816 onwards, we've then got the slave office that was set up, and the purpose of this was to register every single enslaved person in the colony, right? And so in here, we've got the registrations, and we've also got manumissions of every single enslaved person in the colony. So here I've got the slave register of a woman by the name of Martha Susanna Olweg. She lived in what is now St. George's Mall, so off Whale Street. It was then St. George's Street. People actually lived there in houses, right? Dutch town houses. And she owned a number of children. And you'll notice from around the fourth one onwards, there's a number of children, Evert, Samila, Eva, Hessie, and Georgina, sorry, Henry and Georgina. And you'll notice that there's a column over there with another name and a little scribble underneath. So if we go to 1817, right? And we've got the first name there, Evert, and it says 6. And you see that scribble, that is ditto, and that means it's the same as the one above, right? So Evert was a male. Then it gives the date of birth, which was 14th of October, 1817. So now we have the date of birth for every slave or enslaved person born after 1816, exact dates of birth. And then again, if you were born after 1816, it will have your mother's name as well. And so in this case, Evert's mother's name was Eva. And if we go to the top of the slave register, we see over there, Eva was the first enslaved woman that Olveg had in a slave register. And so Eva in 1816 was a female. She was about 33 years old. It doesn't give her mother's name because if you were born before 1816, they don't record it. It gives her place of birth, which is the Cape, and then it gives the occupation as well. So she was a housemaid, right? And as we go further down, we see there was another person by the name of Mina. Mina was 3 years old, and there's some remarks at the end that states that Mina was eventually sold off to transferred to the widow J. Baumgart in around the 1830s, right? And so as we work through these, you'll see that Mina and Eva both have children that are listed in this slave register. So I'm just going to tell you about my own family history and the relevance of this document, right? So my great-grandmother related to me that her grandmother's surname was Baumgart, right, or Baumgart. And we see over there the surname Baumgart as being the slave owner or the purchaser of Mina in the 1830s, right? But I couldn't find any information about these Baumgart people until I started to look at the names and some of the other colored Baumgart or mixed Baumgarts that were listed at the time. And I came across this woman by the name of Georgina, right? And I found in the record that there was a Georgina Baumgart that existed, and her mother's name was Wilhelmina. And there were some other names as well that were mentioned in these documents. But as you see on here, enslaved people didn't have any surnames, right? So how do you try and work back to a time when people are just listed by name and listed as property without having surnames, without proper relations to each other, and so on? And so I kept doing research and I kept looking, and eventually I found the slave register over here that showed us that Mina, right, was actually the daughter of the first woman by the name of Eva. Mina was then in relation with the neighbor's son, whose name was Philip Baumgart, right? And Philip was the son of Johanna Baumgart that I mentioned earlier. It will come together shortly. And so Philip and Mina had relations, and they eventually had this daughter by the name of Georgina over here that we see is listed as the last child over there. And at some point in the 1830s, Philip's mother felt some need to intervene in the situation. So instead of allowing the neighbor to keep her granddaughter and her husband's concubine as her property, Johanna then elected by herself to purchase her husband's concubine, which was Mina, and then she also decided to emancipate little Georgina over there. And so from this time onwards, we can then see how the family that they had elected to emancipate begins to take on the surname of the father himself. And so that is how we find that many families of colored or identify as colored, right, have these white or Afrikaner or sometimes British surnames, right? And we question why, if I'm not white or I don't identify as white today, why do we have surnames like Bungard, like De Wet, like De Villiers, and so on? And most of it actually dates back to this period of either slavery or indigenous people's relations with some of the settlers at the time. And we find that even if the father did not recognize the children, the mother was aware of who the father was, and the mother made sure that these children kept the surnames of their fathers at the time. And so it's through these ways of the mother's own agency, right, in asserting that her child, recognizes their right of who their father is, and then is asserted into a specific status within Cape society at the time. And I will be wrapping up shortly, but just to give some context that enslaved people were valued differently based on their racial mix, right? So based on where you came from originally, you would be priced differently and valued differently and treated differently, right? And so usually Southeast Asian and South Asian enslaved people would be valued for being nannies, for being cooks, for being artisans, and would be priced higher and treated differently. Whereas African enslaved people were prized for being laborers, field laborers, house boys, these horrible words that they used that still exist within our lexicon today in our society. But they would be priced less and they would be treated less as well. And then if a settler then cohabited, whether willingly or unwillingly, by the enslaved person, right, whether they were a victim of abuse or it was consensual, the children born out of that relation would be classed as a halfslag, a half-breed, a bastard, from the colonial perspective. And because of them moving towards whiteness, right, they would then be valued at a higher rate and have a better, sometimes have a better treatment in Cape society. And so it's possible that for one of those reasons, right, it was one of the ways in which the mother could assure this by making sure that her children have the father's surname. Again, in the context of enslaved people, you won't find them having the surname while they are enslaved, but once they are freed, like Casper Skughar's children that we saw earlier, right? Once they were freed, they took his surname as Skughar, which became Sukart, right? And like Baumgart's children over here, right? It's just Georgina. But once she's freed and her brothers Edward and Thomas and so on are freed, they then take the father's surname Baumgart as their surname, and this is the case for many other people as well. And then we've got our Court of Justice, and I'm just going to be very brief now. Court of Justice is the same like the CSC, Cape Supreme Court, except it's in the Dutch period. And in our Court of Justice, we've sometimes got church pensions. So, for example, enslaved people, once they are emancipated, they are allowed church pensions, right? And so some of these church pension documents give us some information. We've got fines. So some enslaved people that committed crimes or perceived crimes were fined, given a boot, and sometimes punished. And these documents, although it's terrible to read, reveal some of the lives of the enslaved people, right? We've also got notarial wills. So like MWC, Master's Office wills, another copy was made in the Court of Justice. And then we've also got your banditenrollen, right? And these are your exile lists. And so we find that many people trace their heritage to either Southeast Asia, and their ancestors were exiled from Southeast Asia to Robben Island. And so these exile lists, banditenrollen, list them by name, when they were exiled, from where they were exiled, for how long. It lists sometimes enslaved people in the Cape, that were arrested and classed as a bandit, right? And sometimes it even lists indigenous people as well. And there's a lot less writing specifically about indigenous individuals, right, within the colonial period. And so some of these documents can bring to the fore and bring to light indigenous people's experiences in the colony, in the Court of Justice, through the court cases, through the banditenrollen, and so on. Next, we've got our municipality files. In our municipality files, we've also got some of those registrations. We've got civil documents also. There was one municipality file that I found for my family that wasn't quite genealogical, but rather social. And it helped me understand the social context, of my family. There was a complaint in the municipal file of my great-grandfather, the same one that told me the bedtime stories, right, that kept a duivelhok on his property. And the duivelhok was a nuisance. And so the lady next door complained, right? According to her, it was a nuisance. Shortly after that, she then complained that his front gate was a bit disheveled and it wasn't built nicely. And so she complained again to the municipality. And so the municipality then went out to the house and they went to go and speak to see if my great-grandfather was there. And when they got there, they were met with his wife, my great-grandmother. And she then told them that my husband is away working for 2 weeks in Hermanus, and I'm alone with the little baby, my grandmother, at that time in 1951. And I can't do anything about this. You have to wait until my husband gets back before you can serve these papers and ask him to change the circumstances. But what was significant for me in my own research of understanding my family is that it helped me understand that my great grandfather would have to go away for periods of time to go and work for his family. It helped me understand my great grandmother's situation as being, although she's married and her husband is supporting her, she's looking after a baby by herself for weeks on end, right? So what was the situation at home like? Was there any conflict, right? Was it uh, another case of her actually being very grateful that the husband is working so hard to provide for them and give them a good house and food and so on? Some of the social relations, and that they had a swak neighbor, that this old woman is now complaining about every little thing that this young couple, whether it's the day walk, maybe you like to raise pigeons or just, look at the pigeons. Maybe, you were struggling and you just put any heck there in front. Some of the relations in the household, in the community, in the street, in the family at the time. Also in municipal files, you'll also find your voters' rolls. And these are very useful also to understand, mostly it was actually property owners that could vote until a specific date. And so black, brown, sorry, not black, but like many non-white people were recorded on these voters' rolls as well. I can't get to the exact date. And so it gives the occupation, it gives the property that they owned, how many properties they owned, the valuation of the property, where they lived, and so on. And these voters' rolls are very significant. Then we've got our immigration files as well. Most of these are for Indian immigrants that came from the west coast of India or came from Mauritius and some other places as well. And also in the immigration files, for many people will be useful, is that you find Chinese immigration. So I'm not sure how many people are aware that we've actually got quite a bit of Chinese heritage, both during the Dutch period, but also during the later British period, where many Chinese laborers and Chinese launderers, washing launderers, actually, moved to the city and married predominantly colored women in Cape Town. And so it's in these immigration files that we can trace, where our Chinese and where our Indian heritage came from in that period. Here we've just got a copy of the application for permit to stay in the colony, and this is just one of an individual by the name of Uzir Buli. It's my own friend's grandfather, and what's significant is you've got a photograph of these individuals, you've got their ages, where they came from, how many languages they could speak, their professions, how many times they came in and out of the colony, when they first came, and so on. So these are very useful, in tracing our immigrant history at the time. These only start in 1904. So for previous immigration, if it was a legal immigration, you'd have to go to the colonial office documents that I mentioned earlier. And again, I hope you guys are taking notes because it's a lot. I usually do this in like a 2-hour workshop and go a lot more slowly and more in-depth. But it's a lot, but it's very cursory at the moment. And that brings us then to the end of our sources, but the actual research process itself, right? So how do we go about finding some of these documents? I mentioned you can go to the reading room and the inventory room and ask Erica. But if you're at home and you want to prepare, you've done your oral histories and so on, what is the research process in finding these documents? So the best and easiest way is to go to a specific website called NAAIRS. For most of us, I think all of us in this workshop today, I'm not going to police how we pronounce that. I'm sure we can figure it out ourselves. I'm not going to pronounce it here myself, but it's NAAIRS, which is I can't even remember what exactly it stands for, but you can just type in NAAIRS and it will pop up the website. And there's an old website and there's a new website. And the one in front of you here is the old website. The new website is very terrible, but the old website doesn't always open. And so you just have to wait until it starts to work again. But click on the NAAIRS and yes, National Automated Archival Information Retrieval System, also known as Yeah, NAAIRS. And so you've got this section in NAAIRS, which is NASA, right? Not the space company. It's the National Archives of South Africa. And there's a lot of different databases that you can choose from in the system, right? The genealogical stuff, gravestones, there's registers of manuscripts and photographs. So that's where we find those photographs that I mentioned earlier. There is Transvaal archives, so up in the north, Joburg, Pretoria. There is the South African archives. There's a Durban archives, all different types of archives. But the one that we are focusing on and that pertains to all of those different sources that I mentioned earlier is the third one, which is KAB. I don't know exactly what KAB stands for. It probably stood for Kaap something, probably Afrikaans, but it means the Cape Town Archives Repository.
What I want to say is just thank you so much for your really in-depth and involved session that we've just had. I think that it's important for us to have had an understanding of where to look and what to look and what to find. I want to offer the opportunity for people to go to the archive and go and explore and find these resources for themselves. We will send a little post to everyone after the session just to give them insight into what they need when they're entering that space. And we will make that available to you. So again, thank you so much, Daiyaan. This was amazing. Obviously, I knew you were going to be killing this, so I'm very grateful for that.
Daiyaan, thank you. It's been very insightful. I think what's important for our audience to know as well is what specifically they need to start their search. I know that when we spoke to Erica, she mentioned doing what you said is going through your own immediate family history and just finding out dates of birth and dates of death. That is a good starting point for our audience to use to go to the archive and actually physically find the records there themselves. And then I also want to mention as well that the archive is a treasure trove of documents of our history as well. Like, it's not just personal records. You can actually go there and find maps as well of not just the city of Cape Town, but other areas around the Western Cape as well. But you can just go and see what these areas looked like back in the day. It's very detailed as best they could at the time. I would urge you to go and look at photographs of these maps, at photographs of the church records as well, just to stimulate that curiosity within yourself to find out what it is like and to trace your lineage through the other resources that they have, not necessarily just the documents as well, but maps are fascinating. So please, I encourage you to do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clint, and thank you so much everyone for joining. Thank you again. We are empowered one step closer. One step closer, Daiyaan. Thank you so much. To everybody that has joined, I want to say thank you specifically to some of the people that are in this room that have contributed meaningfully to by donating to us. We want to say thank you to you. This is an empowering position for us to be as a collective, to now have knowledge and power to action what we need to go on for our next step of our journey. Please follow the Cape Flats Art Festival and Daiyaan. Daiyaan, what is the other page that you are promoting and also managing? I think it's called Indo.
So there's this page that I started. I'll type it in actually.
Yes.
It's on Instagram, but it's moving to Facebook and other platforms soon. It's called Indo-Atlantic.
Indo-Atlantic.
The idea that we are at this nexus of the Indian and Atlantic Oceans.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of histories, around old Cape Town, local histories, particularly about slavery, place, food, those things. Yeah.
Wonderful.